Good morning. Welcome to Westminster's Social Justice Forum. My name is Sandy Wolfwood. Before I introduce today's topic, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the events of this past week. While Mr. Chauvin was convicted in the murder of Mr. George Floyd, we as a society still have much work to do to ensure our Black and Brown neighbors can live as full and valued citizens in this country. We witnessed one step toward justice on Tuesday, but let's stay committed to overturning the systemic racism that allowed last May's events to occur. And now turning to today's forum. Some of us are old enough to remember the first Earth Day, April 22nd, 1970, when Senator Gaylord Nelson from next door, Wisconsin, promoted the idea of a national environmental teach-in. After 51 years of Earth Days, we saw a glimmer of hope this week. On Thursday, Earth Day 2021, the Biden administration announced that the US will cut its greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030. And recently, the EPA's Office of the Inspector General issued a report holding the agency accountable for a flawed process in approving permits for polymet mining in northeastern Minnesota. This is all good news. At Westminster, we haven't rested on our laurels. Several years ago, we crafted a statement called Hope for the World, laying the foundation for, among other things, Westminster's efforts to promote more sustainable ways to live in the world. Our congregation, with the help from the Eco Justice Ministry team, has taken this call seriously. We now get our electricity from renewable sources. We collect and recycle rainwater from our building roofs. We've worked with the city to expand green space, installing a green roof on a new building and landscaping with the diversity of native plants. We're replacing all incandescent light bulbs with energy efficient LEDs. And in the coming months, we hope we can announce our own goals for achieving carbon neutrality. One other key component of Westminster's commitment to the environment and to environmental justice is its enduring relationship with Camp Ajawah, a place where Westminster's children and others have been introduced to the beauty and mysteries of nature. Ajawah, just 35 miles north of the Twin Cities, offers a contemplative setting to explore Minnesota's geological history, to understand ecological systems and human impact on those systems, and to discover a sense of community. Starting in the 1970s, newly arrived Hmong American kids found friends and acceptance in their adopted country while singing around a campfire at Camp Ajawah, in large part thanks to the leadership of Dave Moore, who was part of this presentation this morning. Today, we'll hear 6 leaders from our congregation in Camp Ajawah take turns sharing their knowledge of the camp, its geological mysteries, its camp history, plants and animals, and telling us about an exciting event they've put together at Ajawah coming up in May, which will be open to everyone at Westminster. Since we are pre-recording this forum due to COVID protocols, we will only be taking questions through the chat feature of this Zoom session. So feel free to type your thoughts or questions there. So with that, I'll turn it over to Duncan Layton to start us off. Duncan?
Good morning. My name is Duncan Layton, and my family has been a part of Westminster's family for 4 generations. My sons are Eagle Scouts and represent 3 generations of scouts and campers in Westminster's Troop 33. So how did camping get started at Westminster, and what was it like in those early days? In 1918, Westminster was approached by the National Scout Organization and asked if Westminster would sponsor a scout troop. In March of that year, Troop 33 was started. Troop 33's summer camping program started in the summer of 1922 on Phelps Island in Lake Minnetonka, on the property used by Riverside Church. The next year, it moved to Lake Sarah, where it remained for 6 years. In 1929, it moved again to its current location on Linwood Lake. For 27 years, the church leased the site from the Carlisle family. Troop 33's committee administered the camp, its programs, and improved the site. Scouts and their fathers built the mess hall in 1929, and finished the lodge in 1938. Tents were preferred as shelters for campers. 4 cabins were built for camp personnel and administration. Electricity found its way to camp in 1949. Originally, the camp was used by the Boy Scouts. In 1930, that changed when Cub Scouts started attending camp, and in 1932, Westminster's Girl Scouts first attended camp. When the Girl Scout troop dissolved, a special Girls Camp subcommittee was continued to operate the program. In 1956, Troop 33 raised $24,000 to purchase the 35 acres of leased property from the Carlisle family. Today, campers from Westminster's Troops 33, 100, Pack 33, and as well as non-scouting girls and boys from all over the world. For almost 100 years now, Westminster families have sent campers to Ajawah. Two of those families are the Van Valkenburgs and the Fultons. Both families have been involved at Westminster for over 70 years. It is now my pleasure to introduce Doug Van Valkenburg, who heads our ecology committee. Doug is a Troop 33 Eagle Scout and has a BS in geography, as well as a master's degree in landscape architecture. He's going to share with you some of the natural history that makes up the land around Camp Ajawah.
Thanks, Duncan, and good morning, Westminster, and welcome to Camp Ajawah. There are stories in the forest written by the ages. There are stories written by the succession of plant life, by the hooves of the hunted and the claws of the killers. Watching with seeing eyes can be an exciting adventure that results in a feeling of wonder and closeness with the out of doors. The adventure lies in seeing deeper than the surface appearance of things and down to some of their inner meanings in a way that makes a person feel at one with all living things, even the rocks and hills. Nature never rests. The only constant is change. The woods become a moving story, a movement of centuries, a movement of leaves, a movement of water through the soil, a constant movement of struggle and growth. It's the story of the fight in the treetops for sunlight and of the struggle in plant roots for water and minerals. Refocus your eyes so that you begin to notice these meaningful details. There is a richness of mind and spirit that we gain from learning to read these hidden signs. As we learn how weather and climate, animals and insects, man and fire all influence and change plant communities, we come to feel part of the great circle of life on Earth. We are all connected in the web of life. What we do to the environment, we do to ourselves. The goal of this Earth Day Sunday Forum is to enrich the lives of Westminster members by making us feel more connected to our environment and to Camp Ajawah, more aware of our impacts on creation, so that by coming together as a community, we can explore the ways we can reduce our impacts on creation. What we're looking at here is a couple of photographs of Camp Ajawah. This is the main area that you enter camp through as you come in off of the road in the parking lot. Camp Ajawah, as Duncan mentioned, the campers and kids sleep in tents in the woods. Here is an aerial photograph of the camp property. This is Viking Boulevard up here on the north. The Zodiac Lane comes in. This is the camp property here on Linwood Lake, and then along the road here. The camp road comes in through the forest, around the swamp. There's a creek that exits from Linwood Lake and flows out, and there's a few swamps along the way here. This is a swamp area. This is a swamp area. The camp road, you can sort of see it comes in through the woods here, around the end of the swamp here, and then in. This is the main area of camp. If you look at this aerial photograph closely, you might be able to detect that the trees in this area of camp are a little bit bigger, a little bit more spread out. These trees in here are smaller and denser and closer together as they are down here along the lake. This is the main area of camp. This is more of an oak savanna. This is more of a maple basswood forest back here. And then it's a floodplain forest down here along the edge of the lake. The camp itself, the main area, sits up on a bluff 25 feet above the level of the lake. Here's a survey of the camp, so you can kind of see through the trees then and see. So here's the property line again, the lake down here, the camp road that comes in around the swamp into the main area, the mess hall, the headquarters, the craft shop, the lodge are in an open area here in the main area. There's a tent line at this end of camp. There's a tent line at this end of camp, and then the beach where everybody goes swimming and boating down on the waterfront. So where do we begin our story of Camp Ajawah, the natural history of Camp Ajawah? So let's start at the very beginning with the beginning of the Earth. Earth is 4.5 billion years old. At the origin of the planet Earth, we had Pangea, one big giant supercontinent. So this was the equator here. As you can see, Minnesota was much closer to the equator and had a more tropical climate in the beginning when there was one big super continent before they all broke up into the current continents that we see today. As a part of that breaking up process, as the continents split off and spread out across the planet, the North American continent started to split apart. It didn't end up completely splitting apart, but there 1.1 billion years ago was the mid-continent rift zone as North America started to split in two. You can see these, this is the rift here that was created as the continent started to pull apart. As part of the process of the continent trying to pull apart, there were cracks in the surface of the earth. Layers of lava oozed up through those cracks and spread out horizontally. There weren't volcanoes, it was more flow of lava up through the cracks. And so you can see here, these are some of those layers of lava. The weight of those layers of lava then that accumulated one on top of each other as the lava flowed up from the center of the earth to the surface of the earth through these cracks, the weight of all those layers of lava, plus the fact that the crust of the earth was pulling apart and stretching thinner. So it's kind of like if you stretch taffy and it gets thinner and it sags in the middle. So did the earth's crust then. And then under the weight of these layers of lava in that rift zone, then the earth's surface depressed. And so this is what created the Lake Superior Basin, why we have Lake Superior where it is today. These layers of lava then sitting on top of the earth's crust, filled in with some sediment. So we have Lake Superior here, but then they're also what created the Sawtooth Mountains along the North Shore. And so you get each one of these Sawtooth Mountains then is a layer of the lava that you can see kind of that natural long slope on the lakeside, and then there's a short back slope on the backside of the Sawtooth Mountains. And so these look like the teeth on a saw, and that's why they're called the Sawtooth Mountains. And those are each layers of lava flow. You can see that especially at Gooseberry State Falls, where the three big falls at Gooseberry are falls that come over the edge of three layers of different lava flows. Then also, as part of Earth's history, 600 to 100 million years ago, because the Earth's surface was depressed, there were inland seas that flooded the North American continent. This blue area is the area that the water came up from the Caribbean and from the oceans in Hudson Bay, and the area of the Midwest was flooded on and off over a period of several hundred million years. And so Minnesota was underwater, it was the bottom of the ocean for millions of years. The deposits, the bedrock geology of Minnesota are different layers of this lake, this ocean bottom. Limestone layers formed in the deep water where the crusts of animal shells, the planktons and things that were in the water died and fell to the bottom of the ocean. Sandstone was close to the shore where streams and water washed in sand particles into the ocean shore, the beaches and dunes along the edges of the shores of this inland ocean. And then there's shales, which are smaller particles of clay that are able to float further out into the water than the sand. The sand being bigger, heavier particles falls out closer to the shore. The clay particles that traveled further out into the inland seas. So there were layers of deposition then that occurred over hundreds of millions of years in Minnesota that underlie Camp Ajawah. You can see these brick-like looking layers are the limestone. So those are areas when Minnesota was covered by deep water. The shales are these black and darker areas. So these are when Minnesota was under a medium depth inland sea. And then these clearer colors are sandstones. And those are areas when Minnesota was closer to the shore and the water was less deep. So you can see that the water ebbed and flowed over hundreds of millions of years in Minnesota. More recently, this is then a topographical map of Minnesota. So these red areas are the highest elevations. These blue areas are the lowest elevations. So more recently in the planet's history then was the glaciation, the glacial periods. There were 4 periods of glaciers, the Illinois, the Nebraska, the Kansas, and the Wisconsin that started 2.6 million years ago. And the last glaciers just melted and left for Minnesota about 12,000 years ago. So there have been multiple advances and retreats of glaciers over the last several million years. The glaciers then, as they come down out of the north, fill up the Lake Superior Basin, that being a low-lying area. The area of the Red River Valley now was an area that the glaciers came down and then followed this low-lying area. And then glaciers also kind of worked their way in between these 2 areas of height that blocked the glacial advance at different points of time. Glaciers, the glaciers in Minnesota were up to 8,000 feet. That's more than a mile thick. That's 8 IDS stories tall, 8 IDS towers tall. Moved across the landscape and created different formations in the land. The glaciers always are moving forward. So even if a glacier sits at one place for a while and isn't moving forward or backwards, there's always an accumulation of snow and ice upstream from that's pushing the snow and the ice of the glacier forward. It just means if the glacier is not moving anywhere, it just means that it's warm enough here that it's melting as fast as the snow is arriving. So glaciers are like conveyor belts. They're always moving forward. Even if the edge doesn't move for a while, the ice in there is always moving forward. It's just melting as fast as it's arriving at the terminus of the glacier. So glaciers pick up and move rock along the way as they're pushing forward. They create terminal moraines at the end, big piles of dirt that you see on the landscape that form at where a glacier pauses for a while. The conveyor belt will keep pushing dirt up and create these big piles of glacial till that are unsorted piles of sand and gravel and glacial erratics, big giant boulders and things. Then out of this pile, then the outwash plain washes out as over the centuries, rain, water, and snow and all, and wind can move the more finer sand and other particles that are smaller in size out into a less jumbled plain. There's also blocks of ice separate out and can get buried in and create ice block lakes, piles of dirt that are more resistant that the glacier goes over instead of taking off, can create drumlins and underwater rivers under the glacial, some of the ice moving out. Those can create eskers in the landscape. The geography of the Twin Cities area has many. You can see a lot of these glacial formations in, if we look at, this is the last glacial advance here. So the glaciers coming down the Red River, the Minnesota River Valley, coming in through Lake Superior, and then coming down kind of through the Iron Range area between these 2 areas of highland in Minnesota. But the last glaciers that covered Camp Ajawah and the Twin Cities area was this Grantsburg lobe then of the Des Moines lobe of ice that came down into Iowa. And then this little bit spurted off in this low area, if you remember the topography of Minnesota map that we looked at. So this lobe of ice then filled up this low-lying area. The glaciers drained, the weight of the glaciers pushes down the Earth's crust. There's 8,000 feet of ice, weighs a lot. And so that pushes down the Earth's crust. As the glaciers melt and retreat, then the crust is lower. And so these big lakes then form as the glaciers melt. So Lake Agassiz, you may be familiar with, many have heard, the Red River Basin is basically going through the bottom of a lake bed. As these glacier fronts melt back and retreat, the Great Lakes couldn't drain out through the Great Lakes like they do now and out the St. Lawrence Seaway because that was all still covered with ice. And so a big lake formed in front of the edge of the ice. There was glaciers to the north of Lake Agassiz here that blocked it and prevented it from running north. The Red River now flows north. But so these big bodies of water formed that were held back by the ice until glacial river Warren drained where the Minnesota River Valley is now. The Mississippi River drained this area of the Iron Range, and then the St. Croix River drained this Lake Duluth, which is the precursor of Lake Superior. So these three major rivers were draining glacial meltwater out of the state of Minnesota here. However, that Grantsburg sublobe, if you recall, when that pushed out from this main lobe coming down here, the three rivers, the Minnesota River, the Mississippi River, and the St. Croix River, all got pushed over. They were draining through this area. So this ice pushed over there and then blocked the drainage. And so that big Lake Grantsburg formed behind this big sublobe of glacier that blocked the drainage in the area. And so this Lake Grantsburg then formed behind that sublobe of ice. All that water then eventually was released and was able to get through, and that carved the very deep river valley of the St. Croix now through the dells of the St. Croix River at Taylor's Falls. You can go see the big potholes from all the swirling water when the water finally was able to get around, and that whole big lake drained all at once, created the what we now go and see and know as the dells on the St. Croix River. The Mississippi River, as the glacier retreated, the Mississippi moved back and the drainage of the Minnesota River moved back. I'll talk a little bit more about that again. This is the Anoka sand plain. Camp Ajawah is located on the Anoka sand plain. It's very sandy at Camp Ajawah, as anybody who's been there knows and can tell you. And so that was all the sand that was deposited on the bed of that lake that was created by the glacier. Here is a map, I hope you can see it, of pre-glacial river valleys in Minnesota. And so this is the Mississippi River coming down and flowing out. This is the Minnesota River flowing out. This is the St. Croix River flowing out. But before the glaciers, this was the St. Croix River flowing down here. This was the Mississippi River flowing down here. And so when that lobe of ice moved over and pushed all of the three of those rivers, all three of those rivers combined and flowed down the what's now the St. Croix River. As the ice melted back, the Mississippi and the Minnesota rivers moved back. So this was these are old channels then. The Mississippi River actually moved back a little bit more over here. So it's not in its original channel for the entire spot, but blocks of ice ended up being left behind in some of these river valleys. And so you look at maps today and there are chains of lakes that used to be in these river valleys. And so Camp Ajawah is on a chain of lakes here, the Typo, Martin, Tamarack, Island, Linwood, Boot Lake, Rice Lake, Coon Lake, Little Coon Lake, Netta, and Ham Lake that all used to be in a channel here of what used to be the St. Croix River before this last glacial age came. If you look at, this is a current topographical map of the Twin Cities area. This is Linwood Lake here. And you can very clearly see this is an old river channel here. All these lakes line up. These were all blocks of ice that got buried in debris and melted later, but they were all in this river channel. You can see the chain of Minneapolis lakes here. Harriet are now, and Badema, Casca, and Lake of the Isles and all. This was an old channel in the river as well. This was that other channel coming through some of the St. Paul lakes here. Lake Phelan and things used to be a channel of the river, the Mississippi coming over. And here's another channel of the Mississippi River that used to come down. The St. Croix used to come down through some of these areas here before the glacier pushed all three of those rivers over. And here's where the St. Croix River drains now today. So St. Croix, instead of Camp Ajawah being on Linwood Lake, many years ago, Camp Ajawah would have been on the shores of the St. Croix River. The area around Camp Ajawah is mostly oak savanna. This is a photograph of what oak savanna looks like. Some big giant oak trees under a grassland area. savanna is kind of a balance, a border between prairie and forest where wildfires sweep in. Wildfires are kind of the what determine in the moisture available, determine what type of plant community you have. When you get a lot of forest fires and a lot of and a lack of water, it's drier. Then you have prairie, where it's wetter and you have fewer forest fires. You have forest, and at the transitional areas in between, it's kind of this oak savanna where you have some trees and mostly grassland underneath. There also is, I mentioned the maple basswood area at Camp Ajawah. Camp Ajawah sits in the fire shadow. So the summer winds tend to blow out of the southwest. Camp Ajawah is located on the northeast side of Linwood Lake. And so throughout history then, wildfires tend to be blown by these south winds, these winds coming out of the southwest. And so when they hit Linwood Lake, they part and go around. And so Camp Ajawah is protected. That's how Linwood Lake got its name, is because of all the Linwood, linden trees, which are also known as basswood trees. And so Linwood Lake got its name from the basswood or linden trees that grow around it, because the lake protected the forest, sheltered it from burning, so it didn't burn as often. And so most of the area around Camp Ajawah was oak savanna, but there was also this nice maple basswood forest that we have at Camp Ajawah that grew up in the with the protection of fire that was provided by the lake. So I don't know, I can just quickly talk about kind of the early settlement of the camp here. The early history of camp, the area, this right here is the boundary line then between the Chippewa and the Sioux. That was determined in 1825. It runs real close to where Camp Ajawah is, right in over here. There's the last great battle between the Chippewa and the Sioux nations was fought right near Camp Ajawah. There's some burial mounds over on Martin Lake and Boot Lake, which are the next lakes over from Camp Ajawah. There's a Hudson Bay Fur Company trading post on Martin Lake, which is another lake over from Camp Ajawah. The fur trade was active until the early 1800s in North America. You can see the date of these are the dates of treaties that opened land for settlement. So 1837 opened this area between the Mississippi and the St. Croix River, which includes Camp Ajawah. And so it was the purchase of that land from by treaty by the United States opened that land for settlement. The first sawmill was built in 1839 along the St. Croix River. Eventually, there were 133 sawmills on the St. Croix River. 3.5 billion feet of logs were rafted past Stillwater by 1874. 93% of that was white pine from the forests of the area. That's enough to circle around the planet Earth 84 times or to get to the moon 3 times. The Public Land Survey platted Anoka County, which includes Camp Ajawah, for development between 1850 and 1855. The first settler in the area of Camp Ajawah was Joseph Sawson, who during the last great battle between the Chippewa and the Sioux fled to Fort Snelling for safety. Fort Snelling was built in 1820. His wife and infant son were not able to travel, and so they hid in a haystack on their farm and survived that way. But they abandoned their farm. So the first permanent settlement then in the Ajawah neighborhood, the immediate neighborhood in Linwood Township, followed the Civil War. And so it was 4 returning Civil War veterans, the Carlisles, Broadbents, Wittigs, and Grants, that returned, that set up their farms there. Carlisles were the ones that owned the land that Camp Ajawah was actually on, that we leased it from originally and then purchased it from before. So, and then Camp Ajawah started there in 1929, as Duncan mentioned in his nice piece. So I'd love to talk more about soils and hydrology and other things. If you want to join us on the Nature White hike in May, we can do that at Camp Ajawah. But at this point, I'll turn it over to Bob Fulton, who will talk about some of the flora of Camp Ajawah. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you, Doug. Wow, what a history lesson. I learned so much. Okay. Yeah, I'm glad to be back at Westminster today. I grew up at Westminster. Looks like I'm at Camp Ajawah, but I feel like I'm at Westminster as we're gathered together today. I was in the crib room where my mother was a nurse. I went to Sunday school at Westminster, sang in the choir, was a Cub Scout and Boy Scout, as Duncan said, and went to camp my first year in 1958. I've been interested in the natural world at Ajawah for a long time, but a few years ago, I decided to create a book that would describe some of the plants that I learned about. So I will share some pictures from that book. Most of the pictures are from that book. There's a few that aren't because I didn't have pictures of what I needed. So we'll start with the oaks that Doug was talking about. Here's a couple of oaks. They are, you can see their lobes are pointed. They look quite a bit the same, except this one has deeper cuts in it. Northern red oak and the northern pin oak, very, very prominent at Ajawah. They say that the red oak has a cap for on its acorns, and the pin oak has a cup, if you can see that difference. Here's a couple more oaks. These have rounded lobes, the white oak and the bur oak. The bur oak has burrs on its acorn, which makes it pretty easy to identify. Then the maples that are kind of taking over from the oaks. The red maple is the most common one. I was up at camp a few days ago and I could see these red flowers all over the maple forest as they bloom. By the end of May, we'll see these helicopter seeds hanging from the trees, and by the end of June, they'll be floating down to plant some new maples. The oak leaves are longer. The red maple leaves are a little rounder than the oaks. The other tree in the maple basswood forest is the one that Doug talked to us about, the basswood tree. It's got a large heart-shaped leaf. It's not quite symmetrical, a little bit asymmetrical, but they're found all over camp, and as Doug said, the lake was named after them. One fact about basswood trees is that they flower in the summer. Most trees flower in the spring. Basswoods flower in the summer, and sometimes when you're walking through the woods during summer camp, you can smell this perfume from the basswood flowers. Another difference in the basswood tree is that it's pollinated by insects. A lot of trees are pollinated by wind. If you're a tree and you can get an insect to come to your flower and get some pollen on it and then fly over to another tree and leave its pollen on a flower on that tree, you're much more likely to have successful reproduction than if you rely on the wind blowing. So that's an advantage to the basswood tree. Most of the pollinators are bees, and as I just learned a couple of days ago, you can make basswood honey, or the bees make basswood honey, and you can buy that if you're in Michigan. basswood honey. The basswood tree develops these seeds on a sail, and when the sail detaches, they float down to the ground. Although their main method of reproduction is not through seeds, it's by sprouts that come out from the base of the tree, by suckers that come out and grow around the base of the tree. I've seen this reproduction at Ajawah. There'll be a large basswood tree with these sprouts growing out at its base, and that tree will die and rot away, and then eventually these basswood sprouts will take the place of their parent. It's fun to watch that change over time. We have a lot of little shrubs. We have blackberries and raspberries. You can tell a raspberry because when you pick it, it leaves a core behind and there's a little hole in it. When you pick a blackberry, it takes the core with it. I think I see a black raspberry here. Yeah, and they look pretty ripe. So I think might as well just eat them. Good. Okay, we also have the prickly ash. It's kind of a hindrance if you're playing capture the flag. You have to avoid this so you don't get scratched up. When the Southeast Asian kids first came up to camp in the 70s and 80s, they saw these berries and they said, my parents cook with these. Apparently they use them like pepper. They use them as a seasoning. You see this black seed here. That's the thing that is the peppercorn from the prickly ash tree, shrub, I should say. Down below the bluff, as Doug said, there's a bluff running all the way across camp. And in the lowland areas that we call the flats, there are cottonwood trees. Cottonwood trees like to grow near the water, and they're not too far from the lake, from Linwood Lake, when they're growing on the flats. We have 4 or 5 great big huge trees. See how big it is in this picture. I haven't seen any baby trees. I'm not sure why, but they don't seem to be growing up. Here's what the typical cottonwood leaf looks like, a triangular shape. We have male and female trees. The male trees have these red catkins, male flowers, and the females, of course, have the seeds and the cotton that carries the seeds on the wind. I know there are people who do not like cottonwood trees because of the mess they make the cotton blowing around in the spring. I was raised in a home that had 2 big cotton trees in the front yard, so I have a warm place in my heart for cottonwood trees. They grow tall. They're 75 to 100 feet tall. And being near lakes, they are a good place for eagles to build their nests. I have not seen any eagles in our cottonwood trees. It might be just too noisy there in the summertime with all the campers. Okay, now to some wildflowers. Maybe this is what you came to see. This is the columbine. Has 5 petals, and you can see at the top the little bulbs where the nectar is stored, and they are pollinated by insects that are able to reach all the way up and get that nectar, or by birds. This is not a Minnesota hummingbird, and it's not a Minnesota columbine, but it's a picture of how a hummingbird could drink the nectar from a columbine. This plant is another upland plant, the bergamot. We make tea out of those flowers, make bergamot tea in the summer as one of our edible plant requirements. Now to the spring wildflowers, the spring ephemerals that grow early in the spring. The trillium have come up. The leaves are out. I haven't seen any flowers yet, but they'll be out shortly. We have both of these species: the large flowered trillium with its flower facing the sunlight, and the nodding trillium where the flower hangs from a stem. My mother used to, I probably shouldn't say this, my mother used to transplant these from from Ajawah to our house in Bryn Mawr, but there's still plenty of them left. Yeah. Here's another spring wildflower, the trout lily. I'm not a fisherman, but someone thought that this leaf resembled the coloration of a trout, I guess, the speckled body of a trout. These also come up early. I was up there recently, and the leaves are up, but I didn't see any flowers yet. Here's a close-up of that beautiful trout lily flower. We also have violets at camp. These three different colors. I've heard that insects are attracted by the colors in this flower rather than by the scents that attract them in other plants, other wildflowers. It's said that Napoleon, on the anniversary of his wedding to Josephine, would give her a bouquet of violets every year until he divorced her after 13 years for failing to produce an heir. So kind of a sad story there. I get to the point where I think I've seen everything at camp, and then I find something new. A few years ago, I was looking for some poison ivy to try to get rid of, and I brushed aside some dead leaves and saw one of these beautiful rattlesnake plantain plants. This is an orchid related to the pink lady slipper, our state flower. Just a beautiful arrangement of a beautiful pattern of green and white on the leaves that must have appeared to someone to look like a rattlesnake. Very, very pretty little flower, plant. This is another plant that grows like mad this time of year. This is up on a tent line at camp, and you can see it just covers the ground here and way back deep into the woods. Excuse me. It's Dutchman's breeches. This is the flower. It's supposed to look like a pair of pants hanging out, at least the Dutchman's pants. These plants start early in the spring. They come up in April. The leaves come out. The flowers bloom. They're pollinated. The seeds are produced, and then they die down, and it's all within just a couple months. And so by the end of May, they're gone. If you look at that field here, by May, there'll be no indication there were ever any Dutchman's breeches growing there. It'll be completely different plants there by then. This is another plant, the bitter nightshade. It's got a pretty flower. The tomato is in the nightshade family. There's a story I read on the internet that could be true, that a woman planted her tomato plants near the nightshade plants, and they cross-pollinated. The bitter nightshade pollinated her tomato plants, and when she ate the tomatoes, it made her vomit. So if you think that's true, that's, take it or leave it, but it is a poisonous plant. The yellow rocket is a more beneficial plant. It acts as a natural pesticide. It's in the mustard family, as are the cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, those cruciferous vegetables. Those vegetables are subject to attack by a moth that lays its eggs in them. The eggs larvae come out of the eggs and they chew up and kill the broccoli or whatever it was, destroy the crop. Now, if you plant yellow rockets by your vegetable garden, this moth will prefer that over the vegetables and will lay its eggs on this plant, and the larvae will eat that plant and die. So not only have you protected your broccoli from that moth, but it also tends to stop it from reproducing. Better than DTT or those other things. Here's a wood sorrel plant, leaves just about like a clover or a shamrock. You can put those leaves on your salad. Strawberries, these taste a lot better than the sorrel leaves. I was up there last summer. We didn't have camp last summer. We had virtual camp, but no one came to camp. I was up there in the middle of June and took this picture in the lower right here, and there was a whole tent that was surrounded by these wild raspberry plants. They're just delicious. I must have harvested a cup or a cup and a half of these delicious strawberries. The strawberries have 3 leaves. It's one of the many 3-leaf plants at Ajawah that is not poison ivy. This is a 3-leaf plant that is poison ivy. It's I recognize it from the notches on the leaves, not really teeth, I wouldn't call them, but these notches that are pretty distinctive to the poison ivy plant. We try to get rid of these whenever we find them, but they do sprout up from time to time. Maybe a couple more here. The forget-me-nots. This plant was planted by a woman who was an assistant camp director at camp. Foxy was her camp name. She dug these up at some place the girls were camping, brought them back to Ajawah, planted them, and they come up every year, and they remind me of Foxy. So I guess they did their job. That's all I have time for. We're going to have some wildflower walks on May 15th that someone's going to talk about, and possibly May 22nd if there's enough demand. So I hope you can come up there and we can see a lot more things. As much as I love the natural world of Camp Ajawah, it's the exposure of kids to the beauty and mystery of nature, as Sandy called it, that is the most rewarding experience for me. Now I'd like to introduce Yimeng Vu. I first met Yimeng when he was a first-year camper. He was 7 years old, very enthusiastic. He's still enthusiastic. He's now the president of the Ajawah board and a program specialist for the DHHS, the Department of Health and Human Services. Yimeng.
Thanks, Bob. So as Bob mentioned, my name is Yimeng, and I'm serving as the president of the board of directors at Westminster Camp Ajawah. And I just want to share with you all how Ajawah helped shape my view of how we connect with nature. As a kid growing up in Minneapolis, my understanding of the outdoors was limited to what I learned watching Babe Winkleman's fishing show on Saturday mornings and fishing on the Mississippi River, or listening to stories that my dad and uncles told after they came home from their annual hunting trip. And like many other kids, I grew up thinking that the only purpose of the outdoors was to provide for us. Food from hunting and fishing, warmth from cut woods, or building materials from lumber. And then over the years of attending Ajawah, I had a paradigm shift happen. When I saw how nature can serve as a backdrop to learning experiences and friendship and growth, that process shifted from just harvesting and taking from nature, which is the norm for many communities, and then to preserving it so others can have the same experiences I had. And so for a short story, I remember the first time I caught a fish at Ajawah. It wasn't the first fish I had ever caught by far, but it was definitely the first fish I released for no other reasons than to release a fish. Up until then, I had always been taught that unless a fish was too small to eat, you bring it home. That's dinner. And that concept of releasing food back into the lake contradicted everything I had been taught up until then. My 7-year-old brain just couldn't process it. I remember being confused and upset at the counselor for making me release that little sunfish. But the more time I spent at Ajawah, the more I came to realize that nature doesn't have to be food or fire in order to provide. It can just be itself. And that's enough for it to be helpful to us. And this paradigm shift is something that stayed with me, whether my wife and I and my kids are taking new hikers through the Appalachian Trail or Superior Trail, or volunteering on park cleanups or donating to a conservation fund. It's a perspective that I'm thankful for, and one which I hope to continue to foster at Ajawah. And although I must admit that it's a struggle to convince my two boys, 4 and 8 years old, to release every single sunny that we catch these days, I'm thankful for having learned that lesson. And that's my job as a steward of the land. And I have Ajawah to thank for that. So thank you for allowing me to share with you just this one experience I had, which allowed me to grow a deeper connection with the outdoors. As you can see, Ajawah is a special place for many people and has survived many things in the history. And although we had to cancel all summer camp sessions last year as a result of COVID-19, we are ready to resume sharing this wonderful place again with this year and help kids grow while connecting to nature. Through the work of many volunteers and medical experts to design a COVID-19 safe camp, we will be hosting 4 one-week sessions for girls camp starting on June 20th and 4 one-week sessions for boys camp starting on July 18th. We hope that you and or your children will be able to join us for both the Wildflower Walk in May and summer camp this year. The contact information for both activities will be on screen after we close today. And lastly, thank you to Phil and the committee for allowing us to share this wonderful place with you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of the team today that shared the living legacy of Ajawah and the wonders of the natural world. Next week, we'll share another living legacy. Our neighbors from Holy Trinity Lutheran are located very near 38th and Chicago. In the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, they became a center for medical services and other services to the community and recruited resources from throughout the country. They'll share their story with us. Join us then.